Good afternoon. Would you please take your seats? Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome to Molloy College and the beautiful Madison Theater. My name is Edward Thompson, and I would like to offer some opening comments at the beginning of what we know will be an enlightening and entertaining conversation. Today, you are part of what has become an important tradition here at Molloy. Today's discussion represents the 13th Joseph and Peggy Maher Leadership Forum. Joe Maher was a longtime professor here at Molloy, and he and his wife Peggy became fixtures at the college. Joe is a tough guy, a soldier at Iwo Jima, an attorney fighting crime with Bobby Kennedy. Joe is a patriot, and he liked the rough and tumble of politics. But he and Peggy loved education, and they knew that education was the key to an authentic political debate about ideas. If they were still with us today, I can only wonder what they would be saying about the current state of our national political conversation. So, this event has been made possible by the incredible generosity of the Maher family, who created an endowment so that Molloy College could forever host events such as today. Please join me in thanking and welcoming his daughter, Ann Barlow, who is with us today. Please allow me to do some housekeeping. Our keynote speech will be given by Mr. David Brooks. Immediately following his address, we will conduct a question and answer session. When you registered today, you were given an index card, I hope. If you have a question during the program, just raise your hand, pass it down to the end of the aisle, and a member of the team will collect it. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can. Also, please turn off all cell phones, and please refrain from flash photography. And now it is a great pleasure to introduce to you the person whose vision has propelled Molloy College into the great institution it has become, our president, Dr. Drew Bogner.
Thank you, Ed, and welcome to the Joe and Peggy Maher Forum. It's wonderful to have you here. As Ed mentioned, we've been holding this since 2001, and the whole purpose behind it is to engage in conversation and dialogue about topics of immediate relevancy. So if you look in your program towards the back, you'll see a list of those individuals we've had on campus over the time, and if you just kind of glance at the topics, you'll see that they really had a lot to do with what was going on at that time, and actually some would be very pertinent again to today. This speaks to the larger mission, this event, to the larger mission of Molloy College, and that is to help transform our communities into places of compassion and justice through education and thoughtful dialogue. And clearly today we hope will be that same example that we will have for all of you and that we try to do in the education of all of our students. If you look at the back of the program, you will notice that we were named by Money Magazine last summer as the #1 value all-star in the country. And we're really proud of that distinction because it really measures those attributes that we know are most important to parents and students and that we have strived very hard to accomplish with our students. And that ranking is based on outputs. It looks at what the graduation rate is of your students. It looks at the affordability, the debt they graduate with, and the net tuition, and what employment they receive at graduation, and the salary that they have 10 years after they start at your college. The #1 value all-star, though, and in the regular version we're ranked in the top 80, but the #1 value all-star takes into consideration the composition of the students at your institution. How many are first generation? What's the diversity? What's the social economic makeup of your students and the mix of majors? So we're really proud that at Molloy we continue to serve first generation college students. 25% of our students come from a family where neither parent has graduated from college. So I tell you this partly because you're here and I get to tell you a little commercial about Molloy, but also because I want you to know that at Molloy we are an institution committed to a value structure. And that value structure is committing to helping people to have those skills and talents that they can be successful in their career, but that they will be active, contributing citizens. Because really that's what we need, are active, contributing citizens. Active, contributing citizens will make a difference in their local communities and in their state and in the nation. And one way we do that is to engage in conversations in pursuit of truth. The motto at Molloy is Veritas, truth. And so today I'm really pleased that we can have with us David Brooks, who's here to talk about his perspective of what's been happening in the political climate, how we've come to be the kind of country we seem to be in terms of our conversations with each other. And I'm sure he'll have, as we've asked him to do, some very specific comments on President Trump's first 60 days. But I welcome all of you to engage in conversation with David Brooks at the end of his conversation, and I want to thank you for being with us and allowing us to help you on your journey to understanding how you can also be active, contributing citizens to our local communities. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Drew. Our speaker, David Brooks, is one of America's most prominent political commentators. He writes a bi-weekly op-ed column for the New York Times. He is a regular analyst on the PBS NewsHour and on NPR's All Things Considered. David has a gift for bringing audiences face to face with the spirit of our times, with humor, insight, and quiet passion. David's current book, The Road to Character, explores the road to a deeper inner life and explains why selflessness leads to greater success. His previous books include The Social Animal, On Paradise Drive, and Bobos in Paradise. David worked at the Wall Street Journal for 9 years and has written for The New Yorker, Forbes, The Washington Post, and many other periodicals. We are extremely honored to have him with us here today. Please extend a warm Molloy College welcome to Mr. David Brooks.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here at Molloy. I've been looking forward to this, being back in my home area. And it was mentioned that I'm going to talk about the first 60 days of the Trump administration. And because I'm at a school that emphasizes the value structures and citizenship, I thought I'd do it from a broad context of value structure, the value structure of the Trump administration and the country. The first part should take not too long. Now, I'm going to try to get a step beyond nasty partisanship. I guess as I talk about value structures and citizenship, you should know that I come at this with some position of humility. I wrote a book on character, and I learned in writing this book that writing a book on character doesn't give you good character, and even reading a book on character doesn't give you good character. But buying a book on character does give you good character. So I would recommend you do that right away. I also did not start out as a big thinker and a deep thinker. I grew up in Stuyvesant Town, if anybody of you know it, on 14th Street in Lower Manhattan. And I was part of I went to a school called Grace Church School right by the Strand Bookstore. I was part of the all-Jewish boys davening choir at Grace, where we would sing the hymns, but we wouldn't sing the word Jesus to square it with our religion, and so the volume would drop down and then would come back up. And my parents were somewhat left, and in the 60s they took me to Central Park to a be-in, where hippies would go just to be. And one of the things they did was they set a garbage can on fire and threw their wallets into it to demonstrate their liberation from money and material things. And I was 5, and I saw a $5 bill on fire in the garbage can, so I broke from the crowd, reached into the fire and grabbed the money and ran away. And that was my first step over to the right. And now I'm a conservative columnist at the New York Times, which is a job I liken to being the chief rabbi at Mecca. Not a lot of company. Then, when I was 18, the admissions officers at Columbia Brown and Wesleyan decided I should go to the University of Chicago, which, as others have said, is a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas. And so while I was there, I didn't get any deeper either. I majored in history and celibacy. Then I went off and came back to New York. I used to hang around the Upper East Side, which is not a place to get philosophically deep. I was surrounded by these women, these ladies who lunch on the Upper East Side, where they're so slender they don't actually have thighs. They just have one calf on top of the other. And they've usually married these guys who are like 80-year-old hedge fund managers who'd made their $1 billion and they've decided not to die. And so they're hopping Cialis like breath mints, and they're running around Central Park like 20 miles an hour, and you are jogging, and they zoom by you covered in their spandex, and it's like being passed by a little iron raisinette, these little 4'10", 90-year-old guys. And so I didn't get any deeper there. So then I came to Washington, the most emotionally avoidant city on the face of the earth, and I moved out to the suburbs, and I got my Sub-Zero refrigerator because zero just wouldn't be cold enough. And I lived in a town called Bethesda, which was one of these progressive suburbs in Maryland, where you can have a luxury car like an Audi and a Saab and a Volvo, so long as it comes from a country hostile to U.S. foreign policy. That's fine. And we all shop at like Trader Joe's and Whole Foods, these progressive grocery stores where all the cashiers look like they're on loan from Amnesty International. And so I didn't get any deeper there. But occasionally something happens that gives you a little insight into life, and you see politics from a different perspective, and hopefully from a humane perspective. I do a show on Friday nights with a wonderful guy named Mark Shields, and our show is called The News Hour. I usually bring Mark with me on my way to Catholic schools, but I forgot this time. Now, Mark has been doing the show for a little while. Our segment is called Shields and Brooks now. We wanted to call it Brooks Shields. That would have been better. But before that, if anybody was a long-time viewer, it was called Shields and Gigot. And then before that was Shields and Gergen. And before that it was Shields and Coolidge. And I think it started as Shields and Augustine back in the 5th century. But so I was doing that show, and I did it on I do it on Friday nights, and it was one summer about 10 years ago, and I drove home to my home in Bethesda then, and it was 7:30, but it was still light because it was summertime, and I pulled into my driveway, and it wrapped around the side of the house, and I could see into my backyard. And my kids, who were then like 12, 9, and 4, were in the backyard, and they were kicking a little ball up in the air and chasing it across the yard, and just laughing and tumbling all over each other, and they'd kick it, and then they'd chase, and they'd be a little pile of giggles, and then another pile of giggles. And I just drove in and stared at this through the windshield, and I was just confronted with this tableau of family happiness. And it was one of those moments, and I'm sure all parents have felt it, where time sort of stops, and reality sort of spills outside its boundaries, and you get confronted with a happiness that you know you haven't earned. And it's sort of a feeling of grace. And at those moments, you get a joy that's better than anything you get at work. And you realize you're not worthy of these moments, and you just get a little heart swell to try to be worthy of those moments. And it puts everything else in a bit of perspective. I get this feeling regularly now on Thursday nights, tomorrow night. I go to a home of a couple I know named Kathy and David, and they had a friend they had a son who was in D.C. public schools. And that boy had a friend who came from a home where the dad had split and the mom had some health issues and some drug issues. So there was no bed in the home. There was rarely food in the home. And so they told the kid, well, you can come eat and stay with us when you need to. And then that kid had a friend, and that kid had a friend. And now when you go to Kathy and David's house on Thursday nights, there are about 25 people around the dining room table, and about 10 or 15 sleeping in the basement on any given night. And there was a girl who was there a couple of weeks ago, and she said she was 21, and she said, the last time I've been at a dinner table, I was 11. And so there's spiced chicken, and we go around the table, and we talk about what we're grateful for that week. And the kids perform for us. Some read poetry, some sing, and we give them the gift of being an audience for them to define their gifts and their identities. And what they give us is the complete intolerance for social distance. So I'm a pretty reticent guy, and when I meet somebody, I shake their hand. And the first time I did that, I had Kathy and David's, this kid, Ed, said, "We don't shake hands here, we hug." And it was just this deep sense of connection. And I have a friend named Bill Milliken who works with kids, and he's been doing it, he's probably about 75 now or 80. And he sometimes asks, which programs have you worked in that have changed lives? And he says, I've been doing this for 50 years and I've never seen a program change a life. The only thing that changes a life is love in a relationship. And so I mention these two episodes because they're both episodes of intimacy, of family intimacy and community intimacy. And I've become interested in intimacy over the course of this election and over the course of this administration. Earlier, about a year ago, I was writing about 40 columns with the same theme: don't worry, Donald Trump will not get the Republican nomination. And so having gotten that wrong, I decided I should spend the year out in the country with Trump voters trying to figure out what they want, why they vote for the guy, and what they want from the current government. And what I found was, first of all, just lack of intimacy, a lack of social connection in so many parts of the country, so many people falling from the cracks. It used to be if you asked Americans, do you trust your neighbors? Are most of your neighbors trustworthy? The majority would say yes. Now only 32% say yes, and among millennials only 19% say yes. It used to be people were living in homes with other people. About 8% of Americans lived alone a generation ago. Now it's 28%, and in some parts of the country it's 40% living alone. The majority of American children are born to women under 30 or born outside of wedlock. There's been a decline in friendship. The number of people who say they have no close friends with whom they can confide everything has doubled in a generation. There's been an epic rise of loneliness. The number of Americans 45 and over who suffer from chronic loneliness is about 35%. There's been, even when we're with each other, we're often not totally with each other. The average person checks their smartphone 221 times a day, every 4.3 minutes. They did a study of college students, not here, but at Baylor in Texas, and the kids were on their phones for 10 hours a day. And so there's sort of even distance there. The fastest growing religious group in this country is non-affiliated. The fastest growing political party is non-affiliated. In 1970, married couples entertained friends in their homes an average of 15 times a year. Now it's down to about 6 times a year. There's been an epic rise of suicide. And suicide is just a proxy for loneliness and solitude. We now have 25% more people dying of suicide than dying from car crashes. And suicide started rising at about 1999. And so as I was traveling around the country, the first thing I found everywhere was opiate addiction. And opiate addiction is just slow motion suicide. Then a sense of people feeling betrayed. I came across stories of betrayal everywhere, betrayed by spouses, betrayed by job training programs, betrayed by their workplace, betrayed by their neighbors. It was this, we used to have an exchange in this country that you give and you get. You give to your company and they give to you. You give to your community and they give to you. You give to your government, they give to you. And what I heard over and over again was I give, and other people are just taking and taking, a level of cynicism. And then a sense of moral injury. It used to be you could say, hey, I'm not the most famous person on earth, I'm not the richest guy on earth, but my neighbors can trust me, and I have some respectability in that. And the effect of celebrity TV culture cannot be underestimated. Now a lot of people feel that if I'm not rich and I'm not famous, that I'm not seen. And there was a lot of not being seen among those voters. And of course, all these differences are exacerbated along class lines. It used to be the families of people who'd gone to college were pretty similar to the families where the parents hadn't gone to college. Now they live radically different lives. The people who've gone to college marry more, vote more, donate blood more, are much less likely to be obese, much less likely to end up in prison. The average college-educated parent in this country invests $5,300 per kid per year just on extracurricular activities alone. People without those incomes obviously can't do that. And so what you saw was just the fraying of the social fabric. And with that, a decline in economic growth. Until around between 1948 and 2000, the U.S. economy grew by about 2.3% a year. Since 2000, it's grown by less than 1% a year. That's led to a collapse of the workforce. There are 10 million Americans of prime working age who have dropped out of the workforce in the last 10 years. That's for every one person looking for work, there are 3 who are not even looking. And that's true of women as well as men. Since the feminist revolution, the female labor force participation rate started rising, and now we're back to where it was before the feminist revolution. But it's mostly guys. And these people who've just dropped out of the labor force, what are they doing? Well, they're spending 2,000 hours a year watching TV. TV is basically their full-time job. And they're much less likely to be active in their communities. They're much less likely to be spending time with their kids. They're much less likely to be voting. They've just sort of dropped out. And so what I've met was a lot of guys, and especially guys, who had their best job at 35, and then each successive job they could get when they got a job was worse because they didn't have skills or something else. And so that was the upsurge, and that's the cause of Donald Trump. And what Trump understood, which frankly I didn't at the time, was that I was used to politics, and a lot of us were, that was big government versus small government, the market versus the state. And that was like the Reagan-George McGovern debate. Trump understood that's not the debate we're having anymore. The 21st century is fundamentally different from the 20th. The big debate is not big government versus small government, it's open versus closed. And the way he campaigned was understanding that it's between those who feel the headwinds of the globalization and the meritocracy slapping themselves in the face, and they want closed borders, closed trade, closed social mores, and a really strong president. Those are on one side, and the other side are people who feel the tailwinds of globalization and the meritocracy pushing at their backs. And they want open borders, open trade, open social mores. And Trump understood that these lines crossed the old political divides. And you could take a lot of people who are just being killed by globalization, whether they were in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, and if you could harness those votes, you could ride them to the White House. And he totally did that. And so I personally am not a fan of Donald Trump, but I regard him as the wrong answer to the right question. That he was propelled by real forces in this society that are very deep. And so when he got into office, and now I'll talk about the first 60 days, I expected him to govern like he campaigned, responding to these forces, to the social dysfunction, and basically doing what every politician I've ever covered does, be loyal to the people who got you there. And to me, doing that would have done what Steve Bannon, his chief ideologist, said in the campaign, was starting with an infrastructure plan that could give jobs to the people who voted for him, and people in rural America and working class America. And basically, as Bannon also said, try to create a post-partisan administration. Take some of the populist forces on the right and the populist forces on the left and try to create a new majority that would smash through the polarized stagnation we have in Washington. And he sort of didn't do that. And to me, it's been the biggest mystery of his presidency why he has not been consistent with his campaign. If you look at the staffing, it's sort of a hodgepodge of some good people, some bad people, some Orthodox Republicans, some populists. Second, it's barely been staffed. There are about 700 presidential appointees that any president makes, whether it's the undersecretary of this or the deputy secretary of that. And out of that 700, about 85% of those posts, they haven't even named someone for that job. And so I just had dinner, I can't say who, a senior administration cabinet member, and he's basically alone in I can't tell you who it was, he works in a Pentagon-shaped building. But you know, like the guy's making the coffee, he's sweeping, there's just nobody else around. And it's very hard to get anything done without a big team. And all the people who are in those jobs have no teams. And in the White House, there are basically just 4 people making decisions. So the Trump administration is always on their back feet. There are other people in Washington just are better staffed, and they can be more aggressive and they get things done. And then there's a lack of interest. Donald Trump is always doing the tweeting. There are descriptions within the White House of a policy meeting that's supposed to last for an hour, but he's not interested, so it cuts off at 10 minutes, and then the staff doesn't know what to do. And then on the biggest things, and the biggest surprise to me so far, is that on the biggest possible issues, not only has he not served the people who brought him, he's almost gone out of his way to insult them. And so the health care plan, which emerged not out of the Trump administration, which has no staff, but out of the Congress, hammered 2 groups of people. The people of working class people who are making just too much to get Medicaid, who are Trump voters, and they got hammered, and people between the ages of 50 and 64 who are Trump voters, and they got hammered. So having run with the help of these people, why do you have a health care plan that hammers them? Basically, what the health care plan would have done was take $880 billion out of Medicaid and raise the incomes by millionaires by an average of 14%. So if you are running against the elites in this country, why is your health care plan a big gift and giveaway to the elites? That part doesn't make sense to me. Second, he released a budget. The budget eliminates something called the Appalachian Regional Support Agency, designed to help Appalachia, the people who voted for him. It eliminates something for the Great Lakes region, the people who voted for him. It eliminates job training programs, the people who need him. And then if you look at the tax plan, I think the Republican tax plans have a lot of merit and could really boost growth in this country by eliminating the corporate tax or reducing it sharply. But that doesn't mean he's doing anything within the tax plans that are being discussed now, again, to help the people who brought him. And so what you're beginning to see is his popularity going down to 35%, which is unprecedentedly low. The other branches of government beginning to feel emboldened. There was this fear that he would be some sort of authoritarian dictator. I never really thought that would be the problem. I thought the problem would be he might not be effective enough, not that he'd be too strong. And the other branches of government are beginning to block him on every angle, whether the courts blocking the refugees, Congress blocking the budget, frankly, us in the press, just hounding him every day. And then you begin to see the international momentum of populism go into decline. After the Brexit vote and the Trump vote, it seemed like we were in Russia in 1917. The populists were about to take over the world. But they did relatively poorly in the Dutch elections. They look to do poorly in the French elections. It looks less like a populist tide than it did. And then you see them hounded by investigations. Paul Manafort was the chairman of the Trump campaign between March and August. And a Democrat with some intelligence ties came up to me a few months ago and said, "Why don't you ask where Paul Manafort came from and why he was named chairman of the Trump campaign?" Because he was a guy who was involved in the Russian mafia with some mafia ties, with, we've learned today, some Cypriot banks which look like money laundering. Where did that guy come from, and how did he suddenly get to the top of the Trump campaign? And what's perplexed me about the Trump administration all along has, Russia's a relatively medium-sized power these days. Why the fixation on Russia? Everywhere you go, there's one Trump person after another has some fixation of Russia. And I really don't know the answer to that, but somehow Russia just seems to be everywhere in the Trump administration. And so when I look at this administration, I think I saw and still see potential for them to address the core problem that put it into office if they pivot. But they're looking to me a little more like the Jimmy Carter administration. And let me explain what I mean by that. Sometimes administrations come into an office and they have the full wind of their party at their back. They know what they believe, they're coherent, and they know what should be done. And that was sort of Reagan, maybe Clinton, certainly FDR. But then there are times you can get elected, but your party is still divided, and you're at a transition moment between the old party and the new party. And that's what Jimmy Carter was. He was a transition moment between George McGovern and Bill Clinton, and the party was divided, didn't quite know what it believed. And so Jimmy Carter had the White House, the Democrats had control of both houses of Congress, but they didn't get anything done because they were internally divided. And Trump seems like a strong man who can get a lot done and make a lot of change, but we're seeing a divided party that can't really mobilize itself to pass legislation. And so when I look at the Trump administration, I don't quite see how it sustains itself, but I don't see how it stops being in office. So we'll see. But what I do have a strong sense of is that it will not solve the problems that propelled it into the administration. At least so far, there's no indication of that. And so that brings us back to ourselves. And I want to end for a little while talking about what we can do. Because I do think the fabric of the country is still unraveling, and those suicide rates are still going up, and the carnage of opiate addiction and the loss of community is still the trouble. And I do think the answer, if it's not going to come from Washington, it's going to come from us and how we behave. And I think a lot of this problem was caused by an intellectual problem. And I say that because I'm on a college campus. All the isolation in society was caused because we made 3 bad philosophical bets. And I'm going to put it in high-flown terms, maybe pretentious. We bet on Thomas Hobbes when we should have bet on Emil Durkheim. And what I mean by that is we assume that we're a bunch of individuals, solitary individuals, when we're collective creatures, we're social animals who emerge out of relationships. We have an over-individualistic view of ourselves. Second, we bet on Jeremy Bentham when we should have bet on Viktor Frankl. That is to say, we bet, and our whole social science model is based on the idea that we're seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. But as Viktor Frankl said, what we're really seeking is moral purpose. And we don't harness that sense of moral imagination enough. And the third is we bet on Descartes when we should have gone to Augustine. And what I mean by that is we think of ourselves primarily as cognitive creatures who think, but we're really emotional creatures who long and who have desire. And this false view of who we are has created a lot of bad social policies and has made us too isolated. I ran across a Catholic social thinker, a theologian named Robert Spitzer, who pointed out there are 4 levels of happiness. There's material pleasure, having a nice car, nice food, nice clothing. There's ego and comparative happiness, which is the pleasure you get from winning victories, having some success, some status. There's generativity, the pleasure you get from giving back to your community. And then there's transcendence, a sense of connection to eternal truth, to unconditional love, knowing your place in the cosmic order. We're really good in our culture at happiness levels 1 and 2. We train our kids to be a little good at 3, but we're not so good at 4. And I wrote this book, Road to Character, which is based on the idea that we have eulogy virtues and resume virtues. The resume virtues are the things that make you good at your job. The eulogy virtues are the things they say about you after you're dead. Like whether you're honest, brave, capable of great love. And we live in a culture where we all know the eulogy virtues are more important, but we educate our kids for the resume virtues, and that there's a void there. And the void, you see it, it comes out in the form of isolation, that we're too isolated from one another. And in the book, I talked about all these characters who were pathetic at age 20 but amazing at age 70. And since I'm on a college campus, I'm going to talk about one of the women I admired most in that book was Dorothy Day. And she was pathetic at 20. She read a lot of novels, and unfortunately when she read a lot of novels as a young woman, she couldn't just read them. She lived out the lives of the characters. And unfortunately, she read a lot of Dostoevsky. And so she was drinking a lot, carousing a lot, some suicide attempts. But then she had the birth of her child. And when she was pregnant, she noticed that all the accounts of childbirth she'd ever read were written by guys. So she decided to write one. And she wrote one like 40 minutes after giving birth to her daughter. And it talks about the pain of childbirth. But it also talks, at the end, she says, if I had sculpted the greatest sculpture, composed the greatest symphony, painted the greatest painting, I could not have felt the more exalted creator than I did when they placed my child in my arms. And with that moment came a vast flood of love and joy and a need to worship, a need to thank somebody for this flood of love and joy. I have a friend, she said, when my kids were born, I discovered God because I loved my kids more than evolution required. And that's about how Dorothy Day felt. And so she became a Catholic at that moment. She founded the Catholic Worker, and she founded all the settlement homes. And what she did, which is what I think we need to do more of, is she formed this ferocious commitment to serving the poor and living in a life of poverty and creating community. And I've come to think that to heal the wounds of society, it's not enough to vote for the right people, though that's necessary. It's necessary to build the kinds of communities that Dorothy Day built and to make the sorts of commitments that she made. Now, I think for most of us, she was sort of focused on that one mission. But most of us make 5 big commitments in our lives. To a spouse and a family, to a vocation, to friends, to a philosophy and faith, to a community and nation. And the fulfillment of our lives depends on how well we choose our commitments and then how well we execute upon them. And having a decent society means having a society where people make the kind of commitment that in the Bible Ruth made to Naomi. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Our identities are formed by our commitments. Our integrities are formed by our commitments. Every time you make a commitment, you're making a promise. And when you live up to a promise, you make your character stronger. And when you break a promise, you take out a little strength of character, and the whole thing's likely to collapse. And so I've been thinking about, in restoring our society, it's up to each of us to be conscious of what are my commitments and how well am I doing at them. And I've been thinking about commitment making a lot, and I'll close just by a few thoughts on commitment making. And I was thinking, how do we start making our commitments? How do you decide what vocation is right for you? How do you decide what you're going to do with your retirement? How do you decide who to marry? It starts just with a glance. I read a book when I was 7 called Paddington the Bear, and decided at that moment I wanted to be a writer. Just a little glance at something. You find something you're interested in. I heard a story recently from a friend of mine who lives in Houston of that kind of glance that leads to a lifelong commitment. She heard it from her hairdresser, and the story was of a young woman who was a pianist, and she was going to move from Houston to San Francisco to be with her fiancé, and they were about to get married. And she walked into a hair salon called David's, and she sees David cutting hair, and she goes back to the area where you put on your gown, and she calls her mom and says, "I've just seen the man I'm going to marry." And so she goes out into the chair, and David is cutting her hair, and he's asking her about her life, and she says, "Well, I'm a pianist, I'm about to move to San Francisco to join my fiancé, but I won't do it if you'll marry me." And David, who told this story, said, "I looked at my scissors, and I've never felt more free than I did at that moment." And he said, "It's a deal." And they've been married 18 years. And so not all of us have that kind of dramatic glance. But it illustrates that when you make a commitment, whether it's to a school or to a person or to a cause, it's a process of falling in love with that thing. And love is primarily a process of attention. The opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is boring. That you may get tired of eating chocolate cake, you may get tired of hearing that same Adele song over and over again on the radio, but the thing you really love is the thing that never gets tired, and that's the basis of long commitments. And so one of the things we have to do with our students is teach them how to love and how to be open to love. And believe me talking about this way is not normal. My friends say me talking about love is like Gandhi talking about gluttony. It's not. But then to make a commitment, whether it's to a career or to a cause or to a community organization, then you want to learn about the thing. It's like going out on that date, those dates where you having those conversations and you realize you have something in common and it seems miraculous, like, oh, neither of us like foie gras. That's amazing. We should get married. It's astounding. And so the process of getting to know one another and deepening of commitment. And then ultimately the surrender and the fall, where you just reach that period of double negative where you just say, I cannot do this. I have to be with this person. I have to be a teacher. This is just so deep in my identity that it's me. It wouldn't be me if I didn't do this. And then you really are getting to the best part about commitment, which is the moral commitment. When it's not just you're attached to a community, you're attached to an institution, you're attached to a political party, but it becomes fused with you. There's a great passage, I'm going to butcher it, it's in Captain Corelli's Mandolin, which is a novel by Louis de Bernier. And there's an old guy talking to his daughter, and he's talking about his love for his late wife. And he said, "Love is a fortunate accident. Your mother and I had it. We lived together, and as we lived, our roots grew together underground. And when all the pretty blossoms had fallen from our branches, we discovered we were one tree and not two." And that's really the process of commitment making. And when you've made that kind of commitment, then your soul is engaged, your morality is engaged. And we don't really have a word for the moral yearning. The Greeks sort of had a word, eros, which was the yearning for excellence, to be an excellent person. Now when we use the word eros, it just means sex. But Dorothy Day, who I mentioned, she used the word loneliness. She said, we're lonely to be holy. C.S. Lewis called it joy. Joy was not fulfilling your desires. It was having the highest desires. But when you make a commitment to a community and to a career and to a vocation and to a family, you feel this moral urge to be a good person and live up to the promises. And you're living in a higher level of life. And to me, I think metaphorically, it's like there's a part of us in each of our lives or in each of ourselves that doesn't care about money or Facebook's likes or any of that kind of stuff. It cares about just being good and being righteous and just seeing yourself, I can respect myself. And sometimes that part of us, I think of it as like a reclusive leopard that lives high up in the mountains. Sometimes that part of us in our 20s, it's not really very present in our lives. We're busy building a career or building a family. We're too busy to think about that deeply spiritual part of us. But then it comes out of the woods, and maybe you see it in your 20s and 30s out of the corner of your eye. But then sometimes it comes out and it's suddenly present. The state of your spiritual self is suddenly present. Sometimes a friend of mine said, sometimes I wake up and it's 2 a.m. and my thoughts come at me like a drawer full of knives. One of those bad nights, and that's when your spiritual nature is suddenly right there in front of you. Sometimes you have moments of suffering and a loss, and you get introduced to yourself, and the leopard is right there in the room with you. Or sometimes, like me with my kids in the backyard, it's a moment of great joy. But I do think later in life, there comes a moment in every life where the leopard comes out of the hills and it just sits there in the room and asks, what have you done? What were you called for? Who have you helped? What is your purpose? And those who have not thought about that question have to live with that knowledge. And so we chain ourselves down in order to have an answer to that question. We chain ourselves down to commitments which allow us to graduate to a higher level of freedom. We try to move in our lives. College students, when they graduate, they like open options, but as we get older, we like sweet compulsions. We like to tie ourselves down. And when we do that, we've created a level of joy that's higher, that's that 4th level of joy, and we've created bonds of community, and bonds that sort of swallow people, both in good ways and bad. I have a friend who lives in northern Louisiana in a little town, and he had a sister named Ruthie who was a teacher in this little town, and she taught at the high school, and she just radiated with the inner light, and students were just drawn to her. And unfortunately, she died in her early 40s of cancer, and even though there were like 800 people in this little town, like 1,600 people came to her funeral. She loved to go barefoot. Her husband was a fireman, and the firemen carried her casket to the grave barefoot. And one of the things this woman did, Ruthie, was on Christmas Eve, she wanted the dead of the town to be remembered. And so she went around to the cemetery, the one cemetery in town, and put a lit candle on every gravestone. And she died just before Christmas Eve, and my friend Rod asked their mom, it's Christmas Eve, do you want to do what Ruthie used to do and put a candle on the gravestones? And his mom said, most days I would. Most years I would. But this year it's too tough. Ruthie has just died. I just couldn't get through it. So they decided not to do it that year, But they drove across town to visit a relative, and they happened to drive by the cemetery, and they noticed somebody else had put a candle on every gravestone. And that to me is the symbol of a community picking up a community, and that's what a healthy society looks like. And so I've gone on in this way because I found so much brokenness in our social fabric that has produced Donald Trump, and it produces a politics I hope that will someday fix it. But I'm not sure that day is going to come soon. And so I do think it's up to institutions and to all of us to practice, as we heard, citizenship, which means healing that social fabric in our own way. And I do think that kind of healing leads to the highest kind of joy. I'm going to close, since I'm here, with another hero of mine, a story of St. Augustine. And St. Augustine, as you know, was born in northern Africa about 1600 years ago. And as you probably also know, he had a mom named Monica, who was the helicopter mom to beat all helicopter moms. And she was like telling him who to befriend, who not to befriend, what to believe, what not to believe, how to be a Christian, how not to be a Christian, who to marry, who not to marry. At one point, when he was like 30, he had to get away from her. So he tricked her. He told her he was visiting a friend on a boat. And then the boat sailed to Italy, and he sees her. She's screaming on the shore, "Get back here." She catches the next boat. She tracks him down to Italy. And so when he was in his 30s and she was 59, he'd had his confessions and his moment in the garden. And his mom, Monica, finally says to him, "You know, all my life I've hounded you because I wanted you to be a certain sort of Christian. And now you are that man. You have become what I always wanted. And so my job here on earth is done. And I'm ready to go. I thought I want to go back to Africa and die there, but God's everywhere, he'll find me." And in fact, she died 9 days later. And in his book Confessions, Augustine describes his final conversation with his mom. And they are in a garden. And he said, after all those arguments and conflict, they had the sweetest of possible conversations that rose above just material life into the realm of pure spirit. And then there's a long sentence as he's describing this conversation, and it's very hard to understand. It's like 2 pages, but it has one word that repeats itself over and over again. And that word is the word hushed. And Augustine says, you know, as we were speaking, the wind in the trees were hushed. The sound of the birds was hushed. The sound of our voices was hushed. The sound of our hearts was hushed. And just goes on, hushed, hushed, hushed. And you get this sense of perfect harmony and peace and contentment, which is sort of a kind of joy, just having arrived at some sense of peace and being at one with your mother, with your son, and with your universe. And this is a talk about politics, and the question and answers, I'm happy to talk more about politics. But I do think that the foundation underneath the problems of unemployment, of the labor force participation rate, of cynicism, of distrust, is fundamentally this loss of intimacy, this crisis of solidarity. And that fundamentally it probably can only be built one by one, local by local, from the ground up. Thank you.
This is not an alternative fact, but this is the largest crowd we've ever had, so thank you very much. Although I was told by our social media department that we are being tweeted by the White House, but that's so we have a bunch of questions, and I know there's more coming, so we're going to try to get to as many as we can. Please forgive us if we don't. Number one, did you ever think there'd come a time in your career, as someone writing and speaking from a conservative perspective, that you'd be looked to as a voice of reason by liberals, many of whom find comfort in your analysis of very difficult and troubling events?
Yeah, I'm trying to think how to answer that. I am a conservative. The core of my political philosophy is two figures. One is Edmund Burke, who is a Irish-English philosopher and parliamentarian, and the core of his conservatism was epistemological modesty. That the epistemology is a study of what we can know, and modesty is modesty. The world is really complicated, so change should be constant, but it should be gradual and incremental. And I really don't think we know much about this complicated reality, and so we should proceed cautiously. And the second part of my philosophy is based on Alexander Hamilton, who was a Latino hip-hop star from the Heights. And he believed in social mobility. And I believe there are two parties in this country, but three movements. One is a liberal movement that uses government to enhance equality. Another is a conservative movement that limits government to enhance freedom. But then this Hamiltonian movement is limited but energetic government to enhance social mobility. And the Hamilton believed in this, the Whig Party believed in this, the early Republican Party believed in this, and now there are 6 of us who believe in this. But I had some hope that Donald Trump would maybe wander into that third movement to enhance social mobility, to give the working class a chance to rise and succeed. But so far he hasn't done that, so I've become more of a critic, and I confess on some days when I'm more appalled by him than not, he's given me a reason to live.
Thank you. Every day it seems there is another Russian connection with someone in the White House. You have previously indicated on PBS that you did not think there was a smoking gun. Have you changed that thinking? And if not, how long can the issue hobble his presidency?
I still haven't seen a smoking gun. And I've spoken to people in the intelligence community. A lot of them believe if there was a conversation between the Russian intelligence and the Trump campaign, it probably would have come out now. The Russia story was in the New York Times, and there were 9 different intelligence sources behind that story. And I don't know I have spoken to reporters, but they haven't given me any inside dope. But I assume if 9 people were speaking about what they knew, and one of them would have had a smoking gun conversation if they knew about it right now. So I think there's a lot of atmospherics, but I'm not sure we'll ever find an exact link between Russian intelligence and the Trump campaign. I will say 2 things that seem likely to me. One is, which we sort of know the outlines of, after Trump went bankrupt, it was very hard to find American investors in his business. And so he relied heavily, heavily, heavily on Russian buyers and Russian investors. And so that seems like just a very serious conflict. And the second, this Manafort guy. And just the fact every day including today, there have been some major news stories of alleged money laundering and alleged connections between Manafort and the campaign. And Manafort was sort of a known figure in Republican circles, but he wasn't obviously someone who would emerge out of nowhere and become chairman of the campaign. There must be a story to that.
Thank you. Relating back to your 2001 essay, that's well researched, your 2001 essay titled "One Nation Slightly Divisible," in light of the current political climate, do you still believe that we are ultimately a cafeteria nation?
Well, another thing I got wrong. I used to believe that polarization was just in Washington at the top of society, but the country itself was sort of moderate and bell curve. And I remember I've always, through my whole career, seen a lot of polarization at the top. I remember once, like 15 years ago, I went to something called the Civility Summit. The Annenberg Foundation paid 140 members of Congress and their families to go to this fancy hotel, the Greenbrier, to get to know one another. And I remember I was walking down the hallway one afternoon, and there was a woman weeping in the hallway because she'd been so viciously attacked at one of the breakout conversations. She'd left the room, and this was the Civility Summit. So I used to think polarization was at the top and not at the bottom. Now I think it's at the bottom. And the number of counties that are where one party or another has a landslide majority has doubled in a generation. There are people, this was in the early days of Fox News, they have the chyrons, little images on the bottom of the screen where it says Fox. Well, some people get up at 7 in the morning and they watch Fox until midnight. And the problem with that is if you don't change the channel, the chyron, the image of Fox News, burns into your TV set. And so they had to move it across the screen so it wouldn't destroy people's TV sets. And so that to me is a sign of being locked in. And I think that's happened more and more, and I would certainly say in my travels over the past year, I went to a lot of places where people could not imagine Trump not winning because everybody they know was voting for the guy, and vice versa when I would come to places like New York and Washington and Seattle.
What can colleges do to better encourage civility in our students, the future voters of our democracy?
Well, one thing is to communicate the message, which I think is a truth, which is that most big political issues are competitions between partial truths. I think in most cases it's competition between equality and freedom, between security and liberty, between mercy and justice. Usually both parties have a piece of the truth. And politics to me is not about coming down 100% on one side or the other. It's trying to get your balance right, given the times. And so I think that's one thing colleges can do. Second is giving them practice at debate. My grandfather went to a school called City College of New York. And in those days, you sort of went to class, but mostly what the students did, they were all Marxists in those days in the 20s, they sat and they argued outside of class. And the Leninists lived at the cafeteria, they ate in what they called Alcove 1, and the Trotskyites ate in Alcove 2. And they argued 8 hours a day. And the Trotskyites were smarter, so the Leninists, being Leninists, decided we're going to pass a law, you're not allowed to speak to a Trotskyite. But that process of arguing and taking politics seriously made a lot of great writers. There are a lot of people came out of that atmosphere. And one of the things I fear about students, and I teach and I'm around colleges a lot, is a lot of them don't take politics that seriously. And I try to communicate to them that, first of all, if you don't pay attention to politics, eventually it will pay attention to you. Second, that not caring about politics is a luxury for those who live in basically healthy societies. That if you live in a society where you could get shot in the back of the head or where you have to pay a bribe, you do not have the luxury of not caring about politics. And third, the people I know who have contributed most to our world have usually done it through political means. I have a friend named Mike Gerson who worked in the W. Bush administration. He helped create this thing called PEPFAR, which is the AIDS program in Africa. So I know a guy who importantly played a role in saving like 16 million lives. And I have a friend who just left the Obama administration who just loved being in government. And she said every individual day sucked, but the whole experience was tremendously rewarding. And that's a truth about government. I think it's important to steer students toward politics as a very noble profession.
You may have addressed this in your remarks, but do you think President Trump will be impeached before the end of his first term?
Yeah. In the first, I being so fair-minded, he had been inaugurated about 3 days where I wrote, I doubt he'll last a year, so get ready. You know, it's possible, but the core fact is this. As I mentioned, he's only a favorability rating is about 35%, but among Republicans it's about 80%. And so it really does not pay any Republican member of Congress to go against Donald Trump. It would be suicidal. And those who have, there's a guy named Jeff Flake, who's a senator, Ben Sass from Nebraska, they're paying a very serious price. So as I say, it's very hard for me to see him staying because I just don't think his administration is really functioning the way a normal one does. But it's very hard for me to see him going. And so I don't know where that leaves us except sort of floating in the water, unless he just begins to change more radically than he has so far.
Please talk about fake news and alternative facts and what that says about where we are as a country right now.
Well, it depends if you think the fake news is part of the failing New York Times or something else. By the way, our stock price is up 30% since he got inaugurated. So as one of our reporters says, we're even failing at failing. Actually, it's been that part has been fascinating to me. We've been covering this guy solidly for 18 months, and the curiosity about him is insatiable. If you went on the most viewed pieces of the New York Times website right now, 8 out of the 10 would be about Donald Trump. And if anybody's traveled abroad, that's all people want to talk about is Donald Trump. He is the most talked about human being in American history. And so there's some insatiable curiosity about him, both pro and con. So I'll say one thing. When I'm more liberal than a lot of my colleagues at the paper, but there is a genuine commitment to the craft of journalism. And we occasionally get things wrong, we issue corrections, but if we've written it, there are sources behind it, and there's a code of conduct, because the costs of getting something wrong within the paper and in terms of public shame are very, very high. And so most of the news, we could miss things, we don't, or not, but it's genuinely not fake. I had a story written about me, I don't know if it was by Russian intelligence or anybody. I'm serious, it was a long story. It was about an interview I allegedly gave to a radio station that does not exist. And it was about a 3,000-word transcript of this interview. And in it, and this was the shocking part, I allegedly called for Donald Trump's assassination, and it was an attack on me for allegedly doing this. And what struck me was the professionalism with which this story was crafted. And it was a little unnerving to be the subject of a story that was completely made up, but very well crafted and made up. And I think a lot of people in public life have begun to experience this, and it's sort of a novel thing, that there are now professionals out there sort of doing this. And as people who've suffered it way worse than me know, once a falsehood gets spread, if you deny the falsehood, sometimes you're only underlying the falsehood in people's minds. And so we're sort of trapped in this world right now.
So when did compromise become a dirty word, and what are the possibilities of future compromise given the polarization of the two parties?
Yeah. This is deeper than Trump. And if anybody saw the movie Lincoln, what I loved about that movie was it was a celebration of politics. Like, Lincoln was doing politics. He was trying to bribe this person, well, not bribe, but reward. He was trying to cut this deal. He knew that person's weakness. That person had to flatter him. He was just working the system. And most of us who are involved in organizations, we learn to work the system. And that's never very lovely to be involved in that kind of process. But if you live in a diverse society and you want to reach agreement, that's how you do it. And to me, one of the cancers of our age is a loss of faith in politics and the belief that if my side had 100% of the truth and the other got nothing, then we would get things right. And that, to me, is a form of narcissism. One of the things I worry about is the general rise in narcissism that's gone up. There's this thing called the narcissism test, where they ask young people to do the following statements apply to you. I like to be the center of attention. I find it easy to manipulate people because I'm so remarkable. I love to look at my body. And the median narcissism score has risen 30% in the last 20 years. So we've become a country that thinks well of ourselves. When they give these tests all around the world, and we're number one in this. They ask the other little, I've got lots of evidence about this, but if you ask Americans how they're doing in math, we score, objectively, when we take international math tests, we score about 26 to 30. When you ask Americans, are you really good at math, we're number one in the world in thinking we're really good at math. And so out of narcissism comes the belief, my way or the highway. And that's a deeper problem that is much deeper than Donald Trump. But the basic fact is, if you have a diverse society, there are two ways to get things done, through politics or through authoritarianism. And I prefer politics.
Okay, we have time for a few more. Our president is very fond of Twitter. So the use of social media by our leaders, is that a good thing, a bad thing, both?
In theory, it could be a good thing if we get some transparency. But in his hands, I think it's been, if he's saying that Barack Obama tapped his phones, saying something that is plainly false, then it's not a good thing. And I guess I'm a believer that words do have power in the mouth of a president. And the fact that we wake up every morning and there's just a constant flow of reaction to the tweets has just made a subtext of pseudo-scandal running through the whole administration. I've made a vow in my column, which I'll probably break, to not respond to the tweets. Because a lot of what he wants us to do, especially those of us at places like the New York Times, he wants us to respond and set up the opposition, him versus the elite media. And so I've made it a vow, which I'm going to break as soon as I'm desperate for a column idea, but to just ignore the tweets. And sometimes some of the tweets are pretty big. The Obama one was a big tweet. But it's just, I became very interested. I don't mean to seem too negative. I'm trying not to just be a critic. But I've become very interested in his sentence structures. Because there's a psychological concept called the flight of ideas, where you have 6 words, and then the 6th word kicks off another, and then you go over here, and then that 6th word kicks off a thought, and then that 6th, and he sort of goes in that direction. And I do worry, Henry James said the ultimate power of will is the power of attention, the ability to hold your attention. And I do wonder if he has the capacity to do that over the extended period of time you need to actually govern. Governing takes persistence of attention. And one of the things we've noticed, whether you elect George W. Bush, whether you elect Barack Obama, they were men of intense self-control and intense attention. If you went up to their residence, they had these walk-in closets where they kept their suits. And in both their cases, but especially Obama's, their suits were almost all identical. And the reason they did that was they said, I have to make so many decisions every day. I want to reduce the number of decisions I have to make. So I'm going to wear the same damn suit over and over again.
Okay, 2 more. In this challenging and even alarming time in our national life, what political virtues should we as citizens be nurturing, and what political vices should we be resisting? And there's a note, this is from the parents of Jean-Luc, who appreciated the course you taught at Yale recently.
I don't know where the parents of Jean-Luc are, but your son is like a model human being. He's a great pianist, could quote poetry, very charismatic guy. One of my best students ever, so congratulations on Jean-Luc. I would see him quote poetry and watch all the girls in the class melt. I've now forgotten the question.
In this challenging and even alarming time in our national life, what political virtues should we as citizens be nurturing, and what vices should we be resisting?
I occasionally have arguments or discussions with my friends, what's the most important virtue? And a lot of my friends think courage. That if you don't have courage to do what you want, you can't get anything done. And I actually had a friend who was at a job interview, and he was being interviewed, but he asked the interviewer, what would you do if you weren't afraid? And the interviewer broke down in tears, because she wouldn't be doing HR. And that is a good question. Fear is a good GPS system. It tells you what you want, even if what you want is on the other side of social disapproval. But to me, the elemental virtue in life and in politics is humility. And to me, humility is not thinking poorly of yourself. My favorite definition of humility is radical self-awareness from a position of other-centeredness. That is to say, the ability to be outside yourself and see your strengths and your weaknesses, and then to honestly interrogate yourself about what your core sins are. Abraham Lincoln was a very humble man, but he knew he had some amazing talents. So humility is not modesty. But he also knew where he was weak, and he knew that even his opponents, his enemies in the South, also had virtues. And so he could see the whole conflict from a distance, which gave him a remarkable self-control and I think a remarkable wisdom. So I'd go with humility, and then the obverse would be pride. Pride is a form of blindness about yourself. And what I see in politics is a lot of pride and a lot of hollowness. People who they have an outer shell, and they've lost an inner voice to tell them the truth.
Okay, last question. When you look 20 to 25 years into the future, what do you think our political parties will look like? Will the 2 main ones exist? Will there be something new?
First, I should say, okay, I'll do this backwards. The pattern in politics has been that the parties stay the same, but their opinions change. One of the things I think I admire about Donald Trump was he took the Republican orthodoxy and he basically turned it on its head and carried all the Republicans with him. This is a party that believed in free trade, international engagement, fighting wars abroad, and pretty free immigration. And then he turned all that backwards, and all the Republicans kept with him. And that's a sign of either of his political skill or the power of partisan affiliation is more important than the philosophy. Because the party can be radically different in philosophy, but stay partisan. It's a little like, I should mention this, and I'm a rabid Mets fan, but I realized if the Yankees traded all 25 players to the Mets, and so they just swapped players, I would still be a Mets fan. Like, I don't know what actually I'm being loyal to except a piece of clothing they wear. But parties are a little like that. And so Republicans and Democrats will probably still be here. But I do think the debate is changing. The big government versus small government debate we've been having, that ended with the Cold War. And so this debate is how open and how closed do we want to be. I do think that is the future of life, not only in America but around the world. And I do hope there's at least some possibility, either in one of the parties, or maybe they both implode. It should be said the center left in Europe and in America is collapsing in election after election. And the center right is collapsing. And so politics is polarizing, but there's still a lot of people in the middle. And my hope is that's sort of where I am, that they will form some sort of entity. And it wouldn't shock me if in 20 years there was sort of a three-party system, or if the far left or far right utterly imploded and we had center right or center left. But I say that only because I think we're in a moment of transition of debates. What matters in politics is not only what position you side, but what debate you're having. And we're about to have a different debate than we've had all our lives. And then I should say, projecting 20 or 30 years out, which is one of the final things to be said, it's been a grim period in American life. The past year and a half, whichever side you're on, has not been a great year and a half. In fact, it's probably been the most depressing since I've been doing this. But I do think we are better positioned than any other country on earth to have a wonderful 21st century. That our economy is still basically sound, our creativity is basically sound. We're still basically the country that Alexis de Tocqueville found when he came here in the 1830s, with a lot of energy and a lot of creativity. And if you really want to feel good about the country, and this is why I teach, walk around campus. This younger generation, all the social indicators that went south when I was young in the 60s and 70s and 80s are all heading in the right direction. So crime is down radically, teenage suicide is down, domestic violence is down 50%, abortion rates are down by a third, teenagers are having fewer sex partners and they're starting sexual activity later. This is an incredibly wholesome and responsible generation. They're all going to have the biggest midlife crisis in human history in about 10 years, but right now they're saving our bacon. So thank you very much.
Standing up. That concludes our program. Drive home safely.